My name is Abraham Tolchin. I feel a little bewildered and sad tonight because a friend just emailed me a link to some grainy video footage of a town council meeting where I got up and spoke exactly 21 years ago. I live in Silversmith, New Hampshire. Population 8,000, give or take. There was really only one subject on the agenda that mattered that night, and it was the reason I attended, the public having been invited to share their views. In my allotted few minutes, I argued against the proposal to change Silversmith's name 300 years after its incorporation by the British. And then, before my emotions overwhelmed me, I left out a side door. The issue was scheduled to go to a vote 1 week from that night, and frankly it didn't look good for my side, who I guess could have been called the traditionalists. The thinking around town was that what happened on August 3rd, 1997, and the ensuing unwelcome media attention it had brought to Silversmith, was simply too great an obstacle to get past without an active re-identification of purification. There had already been a book about what happened, a documentary for television. Without at least a new name, most people thought the stain would last forever. I thought my special status that night would give my words more weight, so I did the one thing I hate more than anything else: stand at a microphone and speak to a room full of strangers. At 9 a.m. on that August day in 1997, a somewhat ramshackle white rental bus pulled up to the curb beside the Lurie building on the campus of Silversmith Community College, which I myself had attended for a couple of semesters about 3 years before. Driving the bus was a man named Stanley Czerwinski, age 55. Czerwinski was a former ranch hand, bait shop worker, and welterweight boxer who for the last 10 years had worked the customer service counter at the Safeway in the middle of town. He was known for his very booming laugh and for dressing up festively at work for every possible occasion, everything from Halloween to the 4th of July to Thanksgiving to Valentine's Day. In 1993, he'd purchased a second-hand rental bus from a defunct river tubing business, and he began to make money setting up various day excursions to college football games, theme parks, and festivals, advertising mostly to students and employees of the community college through their bulletin boards, and scooping up other customers with notices posted at the grocery store and the town library. He'd get 40 or 50 people on the bus, give them sodas and pack lunches, and offer a round trip from the college parking lot in the morning to make a couple $100 on a Saturday. Single and with no family left, Czerwinski had to eke out a living any way he could. For his bus trip business, he had no formal setup or even business cards, and its name kept changing according to his whims. In 1996, it was referred to in his paper notices as both Sunrise Regional Touring and Express Recreation, and by January of 1997, it had become Sunrise Highway Excursions. His name never appeared on the notices, though he always handled the phone reservations and drove the bus himself. If anyone had bothered to follow the pattern of Czerwinski's trips since their beginning, they would have become aware that the August 1997 excursion was a little different. He was offering not just a round-trip jaunt to the beach at Wallace Sands State Park, but he'd rented out a large picnic shelter beside the water to host a cookout, complete with cash bar, starting at noon. As a bonus, the bus would take customers to their destination through scenic private land owned by the Beverly Stephan Estate, affording some nice views the general public rarely got. The trip got a very good response. This time there was not just one, but 3 departure times, at 8, 10, and noon. Czerwinski had rented 2 additional buses for this excursion. The only stipulation was that this was not considered a family outing. involving alcohol as it did. In fact, there was to be some drinking allowed on the bus itself, so no one under 18 was to be allowed. The price was reasonable, and all in all, there were to be 141 paying customers, split among the 3 departure times. Because the skies were a little dark with spatters of rain forecast, there were some last-minute cancellations and no-shows. Cars crept into lot C3 at the otherwise empty community college on Saturday morning. You would have had to possess a very unusual interest indeed in the logistics of this trip to look into Sunrise Highway excursions and find out who Stravinsky had hired to drive the additional 2 buses. The answer was no one. He intended to make all 3 round-trip runs himself, but this would be theoretically impossible, since the trip to the beach at Wallace Sands via his advertised route through the Stephan acreage would take about an hour and 10 minutes, leaving him not enough time to get back for the next scheduled pickup. It didn't make sense. But what no one knew was that Stravinsky had no intention of getting all the way to the beach before he turned around and headed back for more people. As for the rental of the picnic shelter and the setting up of a cash bar, those things weren't real either. The first bus left at precisely 8 o'clock, carrying 32 passengers, the lightest scheduled load of the day. Standing at the retracting doors, Stravinsky checked their names off his list, silently, accepting their $25 in cash or check, and offering little more than a nod of acknowledgement. When everyone was seated, he got on the creaky PA system and gave a dry recitation of the obligatory safety instructions, and let everyone know that there were coolers set up on the front seats containing soda, water, beer, and wine coolers. And once they were underway, people could walk forward and grab something. Chips and cookies and apples were in separate plastic tubs beside the drinks. He finished by welcoming everyone aboard, but it was little more than subdued verbal punctuation, a marked contrast to the usual demeanor he showed at Safeway, where customers needing to exchange something or get a rain check would always be greeted with a trivia question he hand-lettered every day on a small chalkboard. If you got the question right or wrong, he would laugh heartily, and you could have either a lollipop or a bite-sized candy bar. On his bus trips, he normally liked to do a bit of jovial patter, make a joke about how everyone should wear their seatbelts until the plane was safely in the air, that kind of a thing. The bus pulled out onto Barco Street, and the excursion was on its way. My apartment, back then, overlooked the street, and I actually saw the 8 o'clock bus roll by as I walked down my hallway toward the shower. My friend Vance and I were scheduled to be on the 10 o'clock run. The private Stephan acreage that Stanley Stravinsky drove his passengers toward consisted of 22 hilly square miles of forest with just a single unmarked road cutting through. A planned nature preserve had run into various obstacles over the last 20 years, and the land had lain unused and unspoiled since 1964. It had no actual summer caretaker, and all that kept the public out were warning signs and a short, locked, swinging fence at either end of the weather-beaten access road. When the bus approached that fence at about 8:25 a.m., Stravinsky reminded his passengers that through special arrangement with the Stephan estate, they would be allowed through. And while there were no designated overlooks or stopping points, the views would be quite nice. The bus rolled at about 10 miles per hour between the fence posts. A later examination of Stanley Stravinsky's finances in late summer of 1997 revealed that his bank account had been dented more significantly than usual a few times in the days leading up to the excursion to Wallace Sands. In addition to leasing 2 new buses, he'd rented a car from a local dealer 3 days beforehand. 2 days before that, he'd purchased a 1985 Ford Escort for $400 in cash from a private citizen living on Phipps Avenue. Both of those cars were now parked under some trees at approximately the midpoint of the access road that ran through the Stephan acreage. The bus began to wind and climb toward that spot as the passengers looked out at the summer scenery. Just 25 minutes later or so, right around the time the bus should have been leaving the acreage on the east side and getting onto Route 1 to finish the trip toward the beach, Stanley Cervinsky was instead climbing into the old Ford Escort he'd purchased on July 29th and starting to drive back to the lot at Silversmith Community College for his 10 o'clock run. The bus in which he and his 32 passengers had entered the Stephan property was now nowhere to be seen. In Silversmith, I was leaving a phone message for my friend, Vance, who was sleeping off a night of partying. I told him I'd pick him up from his group house on Victor Street at 9:30. I'd reserved 2 spots on that 10 o'clock bus. After another depressing week at my job at the print shop around the corner, I was ready for a day of relaxing, eating, and drinking at Wallace Sands. There was a rail yard beside Barco Street where freight from the New England Central Railroad still passed through every other day. In one section of that yard, a few ancient freight cars that hadn't moved for years sat ghostly in the weeds. Some of them were speckled with graffiti, but 3 in particular stood out for the elaborate and accidental murals that one Silversmith resident had graced them with. Her name was Tanisha Draper, and in 1997 she was 9 years old. "Looks like Tanisha's been at it again," was the only sentence that Vance spoke to me as we drove to the parking lot at the community college shortly before 10. Thoroughly hungover, he squinted as if her giant loops of orange, yellow, and pink hurt his eyes. Tanisha, developmentally disabled, had begun her work on the trains under the watchful eye of her father, James, a plant supervisor for Goodwin Foods. She loved drawing and never wanted to go anywhere without her big bucket of chalk. She drew on sidewalks, road signs, even mailboxes if James wasn't totally on watch. The old freight cars presented an open, abandoned canvas. So as they went past the rail yard on their walks, he let her stop to draw clouds and horses, and a very plump superhero she called stock paper on the gray and brown metal, which got very hot in summertime. She drew images bigger than she herself was, and the bigger she drew, the more James and others came to realize that she had been gifted with unusual talent and a distinctive style that made everything from houses to animals to people somehow look like they were constructed from big, happy balloons, puffing out and expanding in all directions. One day a rail worker came over to shoo Tanisha away from the freight cars she'd chosen to decorate, but James was able to convince him that no real harm was being done to these old relics, and so she was allowed to continue. There was next to no chance the cars would ever be used again. They were just rusting scrap, bearing the name of some company based in Georgia that was struggling to survive a bankruptcy filing. No one even mowed the weeds in that lot anymore. Sometimes rain washed away much of what Tanisha had done, making her sad, and so one day her mother bought her an acrylic paint set, which she took to immediately. Her work continued apace. She could not know then that I, one of only 4 haunted survivors of August 3rd, 1997, would, 2 years later, use her innocent work to publicly fight against the renaming of the town both she and I had grown up in. My friend, Vance Thorne, was certainly one of the area's great imbibers, that was for sure. As we drove along toward the community college parking lot at 20 to 10, he was already at it again after his night of debauchery. Sipping from a can of Bud Light, he kept balanced between his knees as he tied his hair back in a ponytail. Always a jocular fellow, he got ever more so as he drank, so everyone forgave him his habits. At the age of 20, I did too. What did I know of the damage he was doing to himself? At the parking lot, the second excursion bus of the day was already idling. A blue and white thing with the word Seahawk on the side of it in flowing script. Plenty of passengers had taken their seats for the run. There was one car parked right beside the bus. This was the green Ford Escort Stanley Stravinsky had so recently acquired and used to make the trip back from one of the highest points in the Stefan acreage. Stravinsky checked off our names and nodded us on board soundlessly, taking my $50 in cash and tucking it into a zipper pouch secured to his waist. I can honestly say I was within 12 inches of the man. My claim to fame, maybe. He was short and stocky, with black hair from which the gray had been crudely expunged with dye in places. He had a faint scar on his right cheek from a drunken sparring accident back in the day. I got a smell of licorice coming off him. A few drops of rain hit the roof of the bus as Vance and I took our seats in the back row. It had everyone a little concerned about the forecast. We were late pulling off the lot for some reason. Stravinsky was pacing in front of the bus as if deep in thought, seemingly unaware that time was slipping away. Finally he got on and droned through the announcements. Something a little odd happened when he tried to say chips and cookies and apples. He couldn't get the words out on the first, second, or third try, slurring them together in a mash as if he were a bit drugged. Slumped down in the seat beside me, hiding under his baseball cap, Vance gave me a quizzical look and elaborately stroked his scraggly blonde beard, one of the many affectations he'd adopted to seem more like a tortured poet and less like an underemployed waiter. We'd both dropped out of UNH at the same time, and neither of us had taken any real steps yet toward a consideration of our foggy future, beyond convincing each other we were just on the verge of founding an experimental theater company that would rock the world. Stravinsky took the driver's seat, and the bus began to move. A woman sitting just ahead of me turned her head back and said, "Is there something wrong with that guy?" It took a moment for me to realize I was the one she was asking, and that she was referring to our driver's verbal difficulties. I shrugged. I could see Stravinsky's face in the long rearview mirror, his eyes staring intently at the road ahead of him. The day before, his boss had asked him if everything was all right, since he hadn't dressed up that day as usual in honor of the anniversary of Silversmith's founding. He usually put on an elaborate pilgrim's costume for it, complete with silly purple hat. Stravinsky said he simply forgot. Later that night, well past dark, he was seen wearing that costume by a neighbor, just sitting on the front porch of his tiny house, with an odd look on his face, a trance-like look, the woman said. Before he'd left Safeway, he'd written 3 strange words on the chalkboard propped upon the customer service desk instead of his usual trivia question. The words said, "Won't stop asking." When Vance had staggered back to his seat from the front of the bus, where he'd fetched us a couple of cans of Coors, he expressed some frustration that there was probably no cell service at Wallace Sands. A friend of ours, Gretchen Kind, a Swarthmore student home for the summer, had been on the 8 o'clock bus and was supposed to have called one of us to let us know she'd gotten there, and had picked out a spot on the beach for us. Her first voicemail to Vance at about 10 after 8, confirming she was aboard, had come through to him, but nothing since. I didn't even have a cell phone at the time. Most people didn't, as I recall. Cervinsky drove us toward the entrance to the Stefan acreage. We'd be there in about 20 minutes. He'd never gotten any sort of permission to go through it, as he'd claimed. He'd merely gotten up before dawn on August 3rd to cut the old locks from the gates in the dark, open them up, and tie them off. No one would ever really be sure how much research and care he'd applied to make him feel confident that the buses wouldn't be spotted by someone and stopped. But initially, at least, he achieved his desired outcome. Nobody saw the first bus enter the area, and no one would see our 10 o'clock bus part the gates either. The last chance anyone really had to talk to Cervinsky, and perhaps realize he was thinking of doing the impossible, the inconceivable, was 3 nights before. A bartender at a dive called The Point, 2 miles outside the town limits, saw him come in around 9 o'clock and take a seat in his usual booth. Cervinsky had for the last week or so made the night bartender, Nolan Garcia, just a little uncomfortable. They'd always exchanged a few words, and Cervinsky was always good for a clean and enjoyably terrible joke, or a funny story about his days as a boxer. He'd sit alone and nurse 2 or 3 beers for a couple of hours, reading one of the many magazines he subscribed to, magazines about woodworking or sports. But recently all the conversation had stopped, and the man seemed distant and preoccupied. On the night of July 31st, Cervinsky did allow himself to be drawn into a short exchange, and revealed to Garcia that he was thinking of leaving Safeway because of money worries. In fact, he'd been offered a really good job opportunity. Oh? Doing what? Garcia asked politely. With a baker, came the reply. Garcia asked him where that would be. Was there a shop somewhere that he might know? To this, Cervinsky could not fully reply. He said he hadn't been told. And it wasn't totally a sure thing, because, he told the bartender, she wanted him to do something for him first, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Garcia left it at that. At a little before 10, Garcia noticed that Cervinsky had been standing at the exit for several minutes, just looking out the window at the parking lot and the street beyond. He'd had to step aside a couple of times to let patrons in. Garcia had a free moment, so he went over and, standing behind Cervinsky, asked him what he was looking at. She came here, he replied. Garcia assumed he was talking about the baker mentioned before. He looked through the window as well, but saw nothing but a couple of cars in the lot next door, the side of a laundromat, and the empty intersection beyond. She just went behind that building, Cervinsky said. Got her outfit on and everything. Garcia asked him why she would be doing that, why she'd be sneaking around. Cervinsky seemed afraid, and never turning from the window, he now wanted to know if Garcia had told her where he could be found. The question was ludicrous on a couple of levels, so Garcia could only shrug it off and walk away nervously, leaving his customer to continue to stand there, watching and waiting for another several minutes. Finally, Cervinsky opened the door and made as if to leave. Garcia called a good night out to him. Cervinsky turned, and before exiting, muttered something about really needing the job bad. Then he was out into the night. Investigators were never able to find out just what the man had been talking about. Left unanswered also was the question of who, if anyone, had assisted Servinsky in getting back to town from the spot where he'd stowed the newly acquired cars. There were no fingerprints inside them but his own. Coincidentally, one of the Point's regulars was a high school basketball coach who was also a friend of James Draper, Tanisha Draper's father. This coach told James he had made reservations for a bus trip to Wallace Sands for that upcoming Saturday, but couldn't go after all, so maybe he could take his little girl there for the day. The tickets were already paid for. The only problem was that no one under 18 seemed to be allowed. James Draper accepted the gift of the tickets anyway, figuring that he'd likely be able to talk the bus operator into letting Tanisha on. But he wasn't quite sure if she'd rather not just go to the zoo that Saturday for seemingly the 100th time, or maybe back to the rail yard to work on her drawings. The spatters of rain continued off and on as Route 33 became Nelson Road, which climbed gently into the hills bordering the Stephan acreage. The old tour bus chugged and groaned as it fought the very gradual incline. Vance was telling me about a bartender he'd fallen for the night before, and his woefully misguided attempts to hit on her, which involved foolishly quizzing her on Star Wars trivia. I laughed. But I was a little uneasy. I would sometimes look toward the front of the bus at the wide rear-view mirror that angled down and afforded me a view of just a section of the driver's face as Servinsky stared out at the road. He was sweating so much, despite the AC. We turned onto a quiet side road that was having some obvious drainage problems, and from there took a left onto something called Laugardale Run. Immediately, the trees grew taller, and we were swallowed up in the forest. Fairly quickly, we came to what I assumed was the entrance to the Stephan acreage, purchased in 1960 by the Stephan family, owners of the largest dairy and sweet corn farms in the state, and engaged in many philanthropic pursuits. There were neither homes nor buildings of any kind on the acreage. The bus bumped over a few potholes and passed the open gate, which was painted yellow. The road ahead was a little twisty, and it rose into the hills fast. On the right and left, the light was mostly blotted out for a full minute as the trees grew so much closer in. The access road had obviously been built for only one-way traffic, though a second vehicle could have squeezed by on our left. There was a shoulder only the width of a queen-sized mattress, and as we climbed to a noticeably higher elevation, where a wide stream came into view below us, I noticed that there was no guardrail separating us from a prominent descent. The bus was kept at an even 20 miles per hour or so, and Servinsky's eyes never left the pavement. I watched him. He seemed to be talking to himself. I got little glimpses of his mouth as he drove. Sometimes he shook his head left and right very suddenly, as if shaking away an insect. We leveled off for a time and saw the pretty view, hundreds of thousands of birch, beech, and ashwood trees stretching to the north, and a big cutout about 3/4 of a mile away with a quiet pond at its center. Around dusk, when the last return trip of the night was scheduled to happen, it would be a nice photograph. A winding dirt path led outward from the clearing and snaked elaborately through the forest, a path so thin it looked like it could only be walked or bicycled. But of course, there was no one on it. In fact, it turned out that the vast Stephan acreage had not been trod upon by any living person for at least 2 weeks, not counting possible trespassers, which is exactly what we were. But only one of us on the bus knew it. Vance told me he really needed to get some more sleep, and he sort of dissolved deeper into his seat. Uninterested in seeing a tiny section of the state he'd probably accidentally hiked on at some point. He was also the most tanned person I knew because of his constant outdoor exploits. I stretched my legs out into the aisle, trying to get comfortable. Only 8 minutes later, by my calculation, we had reached the high point of the access road. The valley spread out before us. Some on the bus were snapping a picture or two, but most were still happy to just talk among themselves and enjoy the free snacks and booze. I remember a young blonde couple up front laughing constantly with each other, their hair so light it almost seemed white. Across the aisle from Vance and I were two women talking conspiratorially about how to go about disinviting their brother to their upcoming Labor Day picnic. I remember an older guy in a Talking Heads t-shirt who'd come alone, making 2 different trips to get Doritos and Diet Pepsi, both times almost losing his haul because a sudden bump in the road caused his grip to slip. Both times he swore under his breath. There was, finally, one giddily nervous comment from someone about the absence of a guardrail. It came from the woman in front of me, who had wondered aloud back at the start if our driver was okay. The bus slowed, and then our driver was pulling over. There was a bit of a wide patch on our left, a natural turnaround spot, and Cervinsky stopped us there, leaving the engine idling. The immediate assumption was, at least by me, that we were going to stretch our legs maybe and be urged to take more pictures. The valley looked nice, if a little threatening, something that would eat us up quickly if we hiked it down into it. At that moment, we were at an elevation point 1,800 feet above, say, the parking lot at Silversmith Community College. Cervinsky got up from his seat, still sweating a lot, pushed the doors of the bus outward, left us, and then pushed the doors closed again behind him without so much as a word. In rising, he had to step around an object I hadn't noticed before. A small cardboard box, packed tight with hardcover books, very close to the gas pedal. I could see it perfectly, looking right down the long aisle. It had no significance for me or for anyone. When he left the bus, many of the passengers looked at each other a bit confused. Was there a mechanical problem, maybe? Beside me, Vance opened his eyes and straightened up. He said, "The precious sleep of Dracula has been disturbed once again," and peered out the window on his right, at the closest copse of trees set into the rising hill. It was tough to see Cervinsky very well from where I was, so far in the back. A little nervous that the bus was idling, driverless, so close to such a steep drop-off with no guardrail. I actually stood up beside my seat and prepared to walk forward to see what he was doing. Then I heard a gasp on my left. A young woman in a straw hat had seen something out the window on that side. Someone else saw it too, and then I did, peering past the 2 sisters across the aisle from me. The view was obscured slightly by thin runnels left behind by sparse raindrops, which had crawled like spiders down the windows. Hundreds of feet down below, the front half of a white bus could be seen, partially obscured among the trees, lying on its side, motionless, broken and ruined. I heard the bus doors open again and saw Cervinsky appear. He was keeping low. 2 men toward the front of the bus had risen and were starting to walk forward. But you must remember, the first 2 rows had no passengers because of the coolers there on the seats, so those men were not as close to the front as they could have been. It had likely been part of Cervinsky's careful design. He didn't even come all the way up the exit steps. Instead, he stretched forward and used his upper body strength to quickly lift the box of books, shoving them in one motion so that they weighed hard upon the gas pedal. I heard the old engine rev. Now my view forward was blocked by multiple people who had risen from their seats and moved into the aisle. But it was too late. There was a thunk, and the bus gave a great lurch forward as Stravinsky threw the bus into drive, even as he pulled away and threw his weight backward against the doors of the bus. The people in the aisle lost their balance, and so did I, grabbing the headrest beside me. I saw Vance, now fully alarmed, trying to look everywhere at once. When the stories of the 3 other survivors of that day were collected and transcribed, it was revealed that Stravinsky had shown far less hesitation in the final moments of his plan on his first trip, and only on the second did he physically leave the bus for a moment for reasons unknown. Nor had he seemed to talk to himself before, or break out into such a copious sweat. On that second run, he allowed alarmed passengers to come very close indeed to escaping the bus through the front, or even restraining him. But in the end, he did manage to get out. Only one person managed to escape through an emergency exit, and that person was me. No matter how many times I replay the sequence of events in my mind, I cannot comprehend how quickly I seemed to grasp what was happening, how fast I calculated the odds on some unconscious level, the speed with which I acted. The moment I spotted the latch on the rear door, I was lunging for it, sensing just how close the bus already was to the precipice. I began to hear screams as I pushed on the latch, designed so simply and intuitively, and the door began to open. As soon as it did, there was another dramatic weight shift as the bus struck something, the row of foliage that reached up from beyond the curb, which was enough to impede the bus's progress, but not nearly enough to stop it. I threw myself against the door. I have no memory of anyone attempting to follow me. I can't remember the faces of the 2 sisters across the aisle, and I know for a fact that I never even turned to look at Vance until I felt myself tumbling out of the bus. The world was already turning upside down, and he was only a blur. I felt myself falling. That sensation seemed to last many seconds, although it couldn't have. I struck the pavement and rolled. A burst of pain went through my shoulder blade. There were more screams as the bus went over the precipice and down, its back end reaching a ghastly vertical angle, then tilting sharply to the left as it descended. I saw that word again, painted on the side of it in dark blue. Seahawk. Then it seemed to simply vanish. No threshing loudly through the unseen foliage, no snapping of trees. Just gone. About 7 months after the bus excursion, the New Hampshire Union leader sent a reporter to take photographs of the work that little Tanisha Draper had done on the Augusta Thoroughfare Company's freight cars. By then, you couldn't help but turn your head whenever you went past the rail yard on Barcow Street to see that profusion of chaotic colors swarming those poor, unassuming hunks of metal and steel. The main photo that ran on page 1 of the Voices section showed the caped, big-bellied superhero Tanisha called Stock Paper, sitting on a grinning horse and jamming a big fork stacked with pancakes into his mouth. Pancakes, explained Tanisha, on the rare occasions where she did speak, were what gave Stock Paper the strength to save the world. There were about 24 images of Stock Paper festooned across the train cars, either eating pancakes, swooping through the air, or kicking back big ocean waves as they threatened to crash down upon him. He never seemed to fight any personified villains, mostly just oncoming objects and bodies of water. She had also painted bulbous and expanding cats, tennis rackets, mummies, sunflowers, round and ribboned gift boxes devoid of contents, bowls of cereal, and monster trucks wearing sunglasses. Often these images were connected with bands of varying colors drawn line by thin line. If you got close enough, sometimes you'd see these bands were 50 lines thick, like supremely complicated rainbows. Tanisha's father, James, sometimes brought a stout ladder to the rail yard when she wanted to work on her designs so that he could lift her up in aiding her to reach some higher places. The ladders built onto the cars themselves were way too dangerous. The union leader story began to bring people out to the trains to admire the work and take their own photographs. Some of them hoped to meet the artist, and occasionally their visits coincided with her periods of work. Initially, Tanisha seemed confused by the attention and didn't quite make the connection between her artistic efforts and the acclaim shown to her, retreating shyly more often than not to her father's side. But slowly, she began to like it when people came, and sometimes she posed in front of the trains for photos. On weekends, it became uncommon to go past the rail yard and not see one or two people checking out the display as it became more elaborate with each passing month. Soon, Tanisha would run out of room. Before that point was reached, the rail yard's owner, a surprisingly young man named Dennis Dufresne, consulted with the New England Central Railroad and the county about any possible safety issues with what Tanisha was doing. He then informed James Draper that he would have the area around two other dead trains mowed and put on a routine mowing and maintenance schedule. The company would list these and the previously decorated trains as lapsed property instead of selling them for scrap, and keep them insured against damage and accident while installing a few minor safety accommodations. And then, he told James, Tanisha would be free to continue her work. Stanley Cervinsky was sitting cross-legged on the access road when I regained consciousness 20 or 30 seconds after cracking my head on the pavement. Blood obscured the vision in my left eye. For a time, I could only lay there, believing myself paralyzed. Cervinsky got up and walked slowly to the edge of the cliff. He went beyond my sight line quickly, and I couldn't turn my head to follow him. I suppose he thought I must have been dead. Or maybe he thought I was alive and wasn't sure what to do about me. I presented a problem, but it was one he either didn't or couldn't deal with in that moment. That moment when everything continued to fall into place for him. He was doing everything he set out to do. Everything that had perhaps been asked of him by a person unknown who was never found. It was time to get into the nearby rental car he'd secreted away and start the drive back to execute the final trip of the day, the one at noon. And then, who knows what would happen. I wasn't thinking rationally enough to play dead. I managed to roll over. The rain felt like it was coming down a little harder. I saw Cervinsky, his back to me, standing very close to the cliff, about 20 yards away from me. I heard just the occasional tapping of the rain on the pavement. Somehow I got onto my feet. In that moment, shooting pains went through my entire left side, from waist to temple. But then they stopped very suddenly. I staggered forward. After 3 or 4 steps, I felt whole, virtually undamaged, likely because of shock. I started to run. Stanley Cervinsky turned around. He had absolutely no reaction to my shambling approach. My left eye went dark again as more blood flowed into it. I opened my mouth and began to holler, hoarsely and wordlessly, in short bursts, like a waterlogged machine gun. I put my arms up and pushed Stravinsky backward. He flew outward over the edge of the precipice. I very nearly tumbled after him. Instead of watching him descend, my eyes went immediately to the white sky above. I craned my head and sucked in a great gulp of air, sinking to my knees. No scream rose from the valley. Aside from the one other survivor of the crash of the 10 o'clock bus, a woman named Maureen Block, who was still unconscious far, far below me. I was alone there. Eventually, I rose and began to run again. 2 miles away from this building, the county is starting construction on a pedestrian trail that will bring hundreds of people every week directly past the spot in the New England Central Railroad's freight yard on Barcow Street, where a girl named Tanisha Draper has created an organic art installation that is drawing more and more attention to this town that I grew up in and still love. Her use of some abandoned rail cars as a home for her elaborate designs has now been featured in 2 regional magazines, and it's looking more and more like no one will be considering her efforts to be a temporary thing. So, what I want to ask the council tonight is why we can't think of Silversmith as the place where this has happened, instead of giving ownership of its history to Stanley Stravinsky. Why can't we consider Silversmith to be Tanisha Draper's town instead? What happened 2 years ago falls a little further behind us every day, and it can't ever get any closer. Meanwhile, her work is seen every day, right now, by the people who live here. And right now, it's starting to be seen every day by people who don't live here. I want to ask, why are we willing to have one dark event define us, and not something made of light? I ask this as a survivor who has many long years of recovery ahead. That recovery is going to take place right here, no matter if we rename Silversmith or not. I think it would be a better place to start over if we fought back against August 3rd, instead of letting it win. Changing our name to me is saying we lack the will to move on. It's like looking up from the bottom of a deep well and saying we're not strong enough to do it. We can't make it up there. These days, when you go past the spot on Barcow Street where the old rail yard used to be, you're confronted with a very different sight than 21 years ago when I made my little speech. It's a public park now, where the 7 rail cars Tanisha Draper covered with her art between 1996 and 2004 are arranged in a loose circle among a gathering of young trees. The park is visited by approximately 10,000 people per month in summertime, and the garden has its own social media page, along with being profiled on everything from the Travel Channel to an Oscar-nominated short documentary. Tanisha herself, now 32 years old, still lives with her mother and father a half-mile south, and has completed the 4th grade. She goes to the park almost every Saturday and offers a big smile to all who want to snap her picture or pose with her for a selfie before grabbing a snow cone from a stand erected nearby. She's met artists like Damien Hirst and Yayoi Kusama. At some point, she lost interest in drawing and painting and became an absolute fiend for jigsaw puzzles. The more pieces, the better. The rail cars aren't going anywhere. They will exist for all time in the town called Silversmith, New Hampshire, named hundreds of years ago by British settlers. Even in the middle of the night, when terrifying dreams threaten to tear me apart, and everything is dark and horribly silent, stock paper carries on in Rail Yard Park, building up the energy in his big round body by eating puffy pancakes, then kicking away tall ocean waves so we do not find ourselves drowning beneath them.
These 3 wrecks here, here, and here are all the evidence that was collected from Mr. Cervinsky's house. It wasn't very enlightening, I can tell you that, but we did find this. We were sure he drew this himself. You can see that all he did was draw on the margins of a magazine and then tear it out. This woman in black holding a plate with a piece of cake on it. It's kind of an eerie image. This is the only other reference to this mystery woman who he alleged to Mr. Garcia had offered him a job. You see how well detailed and realistic it is? He had an unusual talent for drawing, but then for some reason the skill totally breaks down when he did the eyes. They're drawn out so strangely, so out of proportion. It just gave us more indication that this was someone from his imagination and had never been real at all.